Hello, everyone. Welcome. Uh, Thank you for joining us today. And I have to confess that I've been listening to the Moonlight Sonata for the last 2 or 3 minutes, and I feel a little bit mellow. And I wonder how it would be if we gave our academic papers with a background of the Moonlight Sonata or something like that. That's something to consider. But today we haven't really planned for that. We have planned for a much kind of, more bare approach, which, however, we hope will lead to an interesting conversation of what are fascinating papers. Those of you who were also present yesterday will know that our format is that our discussant will begin with a 20-minute presentation and commentary on the paper we have shared, and the author of the paper will follow with 10 minutes response, and then we will open it up for questions from all of you. And we do hope that many of you will participate in the questions. Hopefully this will leave us about 20 minutes for questions, which will also mean that we will end at 5:02, so that we have a 5-minute break and then move to our next panel. So without further ado, let me present the participants in this panel. Our author is Professor Rebecca Hamlin. She is Associate Professor of Legal Studies and Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And she has been a well-known commentator and scholar in areas of law and immigration politics, as well as specific interest in immigration categorization and the evolution of these categories. And as you will see, her paper indeed very much comments on that evolution. And the paper is called Unraveling Trump, the End of Asylum and the Prospects of Restoring Lost Time. And the commentator, the discussant on that paper is Professor Noura Lori, who is Assistant Professor of International Relations at Boston University Pardee School of Global Studies, and whose research focuses on the political economy of migration, the development of security institutions and international migration control, and the establishment and growth of national identity systems. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Luri, who will begin with discussing for about 20 minutes the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to Tali, to Danielle, to all of the organizers. This has been such a rich conference, and I have to say that A, it's good to see familiar faces, and B, it's wonderful to see faces for the people whose work I've engaged with and haven't had a chance to actually meet and talk to. So Professor Hamlin fits into that category, and I was really just honored and very excited to read this paper in particular, and it's something of great interest to me. So I'm not sure that I'm going to take a full 20 minutes, but I would like to begin by just briefly providing an overview of the argument. And, I know everyone's read the papers, but sometimes it can be helpful, and then use that as an entryway to talk about what I think is theoretically innovative and the contributions that this paper makes, and then end with more of a discussion question about the political possibilities and path forward. So some, the normative implications, the political implications, but also potentially legal strategies. And I think that with this group in particular, it's exciting to think through that. So the paper is called Unraveling Trump, the End of Asylum and the Prospects of Restoring Lost Time. Hamlin's paper builds upon and expands her important work on cross-national variation in refugee resettlement regimes. Excuse me, I always forget to do this. So specifically her 2014 book, Let Me Be a Refugee, Administrative Justice and the Politics of Asylum in the United States, Canada, and Australia. Hamlin characterizes the US asylum system as being ambiguously situated in a spectrum between the more inclusive practices and structure of the Canadian system and the more exclusionary policies of Australia. I say ambiguously because she shows that the US could really go in either direction. And I think one thing I love about her work is she calls attention to not only refugee resettlement policies, or regime types, democratic regimes, but also the infrastructures for refugee resettlement and how they evolve and how that actually creates variation even among very similarly situated states, advanced liberal democracies. So one of her key findings was that the factor which explained cross-national variation in these otherwise similar states was the degree to which each country's asylum system was insulated from the exclusionary politics of border control. So as she puts it, every destination state has exclusionary politics, but that politics does not trickle down to affect decisions regarding individual asylum seekers to the same degree in every destination. And with regard to the American RSD regime, refugee settlement determination regime, she concluded, excuse me, that because Congress had repeatedly declined to invest in administrative agencies tasked with conducting refugee status determination, the American asylum system was not properly insulated from restrictive anti-immigrant politics. And what she published in 2014 proved to be, unfortunately, quite relevant to what we saw happening. So in other words, the system was vulnerable to the onslaught that could occur if a highly restrictionist politics took place, as it did beginning in 2016. So as Trump's policies have revealed, as she puts it, Trump's policies have revealed just how quote unquote thinly insulated the US asylum system was from rampant xenophobia. As she shows, the Trump's administration has been successful at exploiting the vulnerability of the system to fortify the US territory as a fortress from which even the most desperate seekers of protection are denied entry. As a side note, I think that he not only exploited the vulnerability to put forth restriction of policies, but it was so interesting to understand how he capitalized on this vulnerability for his political and economic gains. And I'm thinking here not just electoral politics, but it's just interesting I have no idea the scale or direction of all the monetary flows that have gone into the private companies that he's brought into border control, migrant detention, deportation. So I digress, but it seems like there's a whole kind of economy that emerges with interests in private companies that help push this in this direction. So, but the question at hand in this paper, and I think also for us politically, is what is to be done? So even with a new presidential administration that has called for restore asylum now, what will it take to actually move the system back to where it was or towards more inclusive policies and practices? In this paper, she argues that both the concept of restoration and the notion of urgency are much more complex than they seem. Trump's crackdown on asylum was able to take hold so firmly and quickly because the system was already extremely vulnerable. And the design of the system will also make this administration's efforts to end asylum, make Trump's administration's efforts to end asylum in the United States very difficult to actually undo or unravel. And again, I think Hamlin reminds us that it's not just the policies themselves, but the infrastructure for migration enforcement and asylum resettlement that matters. And as she puts it, uninsulated regimes are vulnerable to a deterrence orientation, becoming not just a temporary hiccup, but institutionally embedded in ways that are difficult to reverse. So there's two objectives to this paper. One is to map and explain as an outcome of interest, what has the destruction of the US RSD system look like? What have these policies actually entailed? And then two, to think about the political possibilities of how to undo this destruction. And I think in the paper we get the first part, and I'm hoping that our discussion can kind of push the second part. So I think that what makes Hamlin's work so important for me is that it's empirically rich. So as much as I thought I was paying attention to the news and knew what Trump was doing in terms of at least migration policies, I learned so much about the sheer scale of this retrenchment in the US asylum system. And I think more importantly, why it was possible for this to occur. And again, that this is not just a story about a strong man or populist politics, but really the structural weaknesses and vulnerabilities of the system itself. And she argues that the US is an uninsulated system because essentially the American RSD regime is so fragmented and so dominated by adversarial decision-making bodies. And as a side effect, there are multiple entry points for exclusionary politics to influence that process. And I think we can come back to this in the end. So the same way, I think that this challenge also provides an opportunity. If there's so many entry points for exclusionary politics to influence the process, are there also multiple entry points for more progressive or inclusive politics to influence that process? So I found also the comparative approach to be incredibly helpful. So striking, one thing that I found striking, and I feel like, I don't know if Kai has managed to join us, she and I were really trying to find evidence of kind of policy diffusion or learning between these advanced liberal democracies, and I thought you beautifully empirically traced that kind of policy learning or diffusion, and that with the quote from the phone call between Trump and Turnbull, "You are worse than I am," and as a side note, it's interesting how bad means powerful and good. I also think, and this is where I'll focus the majority of my comments, that the piece is incredibly theoretically rich, and that Hamlin points to the temporal politics of migration enforcement in ways that can inform our research outside of the U.S. case. And then finally, I think after I look at 5 ways that she does that, and then I'll turn to some of the policy implications. So in terms of in terms of the key, thinking about the theoretical contributions, I think this piece reminds us really that in addition to kind of paying attention to the spatial or territorial logics and politics of migration enforcement, where borders, thinking about where borders lie, how borders have been pushed out, thinking about Eilert Shahar's work here, or moved in into the interior. And so I think we can think about this as spatial dimensions, but Hamlin's also pointing to the temporal politics of migration enforcement, and the way that time is strategically used to increase discretionary power over who's allowed to reside in a country, and for how long and with what rights, and whether that time spent will count towards something like permanent residency or citizenship or inclusion. So thinking about the multiple ways that she used time, first is the evolution of policies over time. So one is the impact of how policies evolve through repeated actions. And here, importantly, I'm thinking of not just actions, but also unwillingness to take action. And here I'm thinking of the Hamlin's point that Congress has repeatedly declined to invest in administrative agencies. And so that shows how this repetition of refusing to take action has actually led down the line to former structural outcome. And so it makes me think about this interaction between formal institutions and informal institutions, and in the way that daily practices or repeated practices can actually change the expected outcome that we would expect from just the formal policies and formal institutional structure. So that's one, I think, important way that it's coming in, building upon this rich literature in political science around historical institutionalism. So, second, I think, and also kind of connecting to this historical institutionalism, is the way that time functions as a critical juncture or rupture. Here we look at specific periods or situations of uncertainty in which decisions of important actors are causally decisive for the selection of one path of institutional development over other possible paths. And as Hamlin points out, in this very short period of time, there's a speed of policies. So Trump's attack on, and the scale is also really important. So in this critical juncture, as she puts it, Trump's attack on the US RSD regime has left no institutional player untouched. So again, once this direction has been established, it becomes very challenging to understand how to retrench or undo that direction. And I think her piece looks at really gives us a good way of thinking about these interactions between structure and agency. And one sometimes institutional critiques that focus on the fragmentation of a political system can have the effect of creating a kind of disembodied narrative of, well, this is just a system. And I think that Hamlin really shows this is a system, this is why it is developed because of actions, because of decisions. And then this is how actors also strategically use those vulnerabilities. And I think that for me, that becomes a very powerful way of bringing actors back when we're talking about institutional violence. And sometimes, you know, narratives of governmentality or neoliberal sort of forms of governance can have the unintended consequences of, like, you know, making us not pay attention to the people who are taking being intentional about these policies. And so thinking about both structure and then intention here, I thought was really powerful. Third, I love this discussion of the lost time, and here thinking about chronological time, the unfolding of the clock, time as duration. Part of, as she puts it, part of taking stock also includes calculating the time that has been and will still be lost. So again, because the unfolding of time matters for institutional development, then we have to actually pay attention to lost time, and how lost time also has political effects. So we can't just snap our fingers and undo this duration just because we want to, or we have the political will in order to reverse these policies. So another thing thinking here about lost time is not just the speed of changes, but also the secrecy around them has meant that one of the major obstacles to undoing the Trump effect is simply identifying and mapping all of the hundreds of changes and procedures that are lesser known. And I think I was thinking it's not just, you know, it's like you're kind of pointing to how standard operating procedures have also shifted in ways that aren't really, you know, sexy headlines in the way that the wall is, but has profound effects on the mechanics of the system as a whole. So the secrecy, the speed, and the fact that we can't simply time itself has a political effect that we can't necessarily undo. So fourth, she points to how disjunctures between chronological time and how time is counted under the mantle of the law, or how the time of migrants is counted or miscounted. So one of the reasons we care about time as duration in democratic politics is because it's supposed to be a great equalizer. And Hamlin cites Elizabeth Cohen's Political Value of Time, and it's such a beautiful book. And I think what Cohen does in that book is she reminds us, you know, one of the reasons time is so important is because it's supposed to be felt in the same way by everyone, but in reality, it's not how much time an individual has resided in a territory, but rather how that time is counted by the state. And in that way, states can slow down or speed up the time of migrants in order to increase their discretionary power over who can or cannot enter a territory, or under what, how long they can stay, what rights they would have. So slowing down the time of undesirable migrants, here I'm thinking of what Hamlin does, but also big literature on waiting as a form of refugee management. So, you know, as Hamlin puts it, under the system that Trump and his cronies devised, many people were denied asylum, but many more were forced to sacrifice years of their lives without any answer at all. And this is something I really sort of think about in my own work, which totally different context in the Middle East, but the way that waiting also kind of fractures the ability to calculate, to make decisions in the long term, or collective action, the kind of systemic uncertainty that comes from simply not knowing, not being included or excluded. And so when we're thinking about waiting, it's not just making people wait for decisions, it may be the reverse of expediting removal decisions. So thinking about speed here becomes, speed or delays become important for sort of putting certain political interests in one direction or another. I don't know if that makes sense. But time in migration enforcement matters not just because decisions to make people wait, but also because of the way that time is counted under the mantle of the law. And here I'm thinking how different legal statuses count the time of different migrants differently. So you don't mention them in the paper, but all the non-immigrant visas in the United States where your time does not count. If you're on a non-immigrant visa, then it doesn't matter if you're here for 5 years, that time does not count towards eligibility for permanent residency. And I think that to think about why this is strategic, we just have to think back to taxation. So when it comes to taxation, time is time. You're here for 4 years and you're going to be taxed as a citizen. And we'll count to the day, I had to do this so many times. We'll count to the day to look at your physical presence. And that's going to be, then we're determining whether you're a resident, US resident for tax purposes. But if you're an F1 visa or J1 visa or temporary protected status, you could be here for decades and none of that time would count. So I think the law becomes a really important way that we're kind of dismantling the unfolding of time under the as duration, the unfolding of the clock from how time is actually codified and counted in these legal statuses. I think, temporary protected status, Cecilia Menjivar's work on El Salvadorians is I think, very powerful here for showing how, someone could be in the United States for 30 years and then have El Salvador taken off the TPS list, and then they're immediately, quote unquote, deportable or illegal. I think that this is about not just migration restriction, this use of time in these strategic ways, but also about discretionary power of bringing people you want in. And so we can, juxtapose the temporary protected status, temporary work authorization kind of systems from citizenship by investment schemes or residency by investment, where the states are speeding up the time of more desirable high net worth individuals. So, when it comes to a citizenship by investment scheme, we're going to waive the residency requirement. Your time, you don't need to do that time, whereas other people need to do more time. So I think that the way that you're kind of pointing to the temporal politics here is really important. So here. Yeah, so miscounting people's time is a form of border control. Different legal mechanisms are used to delay, speed up, or potentially even just completely suspend chronological time for individuals. And I think that I've seen the work on this, including my own, really focuses on what this means for people's lived experience. But I think what you do here that is really important is bringing it back to how time matters for understanding an institutional framework and the standard operating procedures of migration enforcement. So finally, the fifth way that I think time operates in this paper is thinking about urgency and time pressure. And here we go from the laws and the institutions to really kind of the micro level of these individual decision making and behavior. And so I really appreciated that, I know that don't spend so much time, and so there's only so much you can do in a short paper, but this discussion of the mental health and of these asylum officers and how the structure of the workload and the backlog and competing narratives and time pressures and understaffing has led to also has this impact. So thinking about urgency as influencing individual decision making, I thought was really powerful. So let's end with the policy implications or the kind of what is to be done, to ask Lenin's question. Hamlin points out, when a system has been unraveled to this degree, we must ask ourselves whether it can be reassembled, how long that would take, and how much waiting people must endure in the meantime. Given that reality, even dramatic reversals of policy must be viewed in light of what has irretrievably been lost. in understanding what might take its place, we must ask ourselves what kind of vision is required to achieve something new, and how the institutional and legal landscape will shape and constrain what may be politically possible. So I mean, I think what's this invitation is also for imagination, for us to rethink and be creative about how we can influence, and in the same way that Trump sort of uses strategically the vulnerabilities of the system, where are the pressure points in the system where we can think about our politics. And so maybe that's something that Rebecca, you might want to answer in terms of a question. When I was thinking, going back to your paper, I was thinking, okay, where are the moments where we see these possibilities? I think one is just mapping the scope, the breadth of these changes, understanding them. But I wonder if you, I mean, especially given how long you've been working on the system, the book, the comparative implications, whether you can take a moment to reflect on what you know about the way in which the system is fragmented to identify various entry points for political action, and potentially on different scales. So yeah, again, when I was reading about the asylum officials, I was thinking, wow, you know, maybe what we need is more immigration officers. And it's counterintuitive because I wouldn't have thought, like, actually add more, mobilize more bodies into this migration enforcement and adjudication system might lead to more inclusive impact. So where else, how else should we be thinking about the political possibilities? But so I'll end there and just say thank you again. I really learned from this paper and really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you very much, Professor Laurie. Professor Hamlin.
Can you hear me? Thank you so much, Nora. This was a really helpful set of comments. And also thank you to Tali for inviting me to be a part of this project. It gave me an opportunity to do some reflection and take stock of the past 4 years in a way that I think I was frankly afraid to sit down and really do, because we have been bombarded so relentlessly for years. And I know those people who are actually practicing immigration law who've been on the front lines of this, and of course, migrants themselves have not been able to avoid it. But I know I myself, I think, have been guilty at moments of burying my head in the sand because I felt so overwhelmed by it all and so helpless in the face of it all that I didn't fully, I think it's actually physically impossible to fully take on board everything that has happened, because I know Lucas Gutentag's project, I think, employs now like 700 people or something like that, all trying to collect it all, or it's like a couple hundred anyway. So I guess the first thing I'll just say is, I think that this, you were very, very kind and generous, Nora, and that's, I appreciate it. This paper is absolutely a product of its time, a product of the moment in which it has been written, because I think I'm still processing everything that's happened, and in many ways still actively mourning everything that's been lost. And so it's a very like emotional piece for me. And also it's just a really uncertain moment. And so it's hard, I think, to be authoritative when I truly don't know what is next, right? We're still only 60 days into this new world. So I think I hedge a little bit about what comes next, because I don't know the answer. But I think whatever this paper ends up being, it'll be a spotlight on the moment that we're in, which is really a transitional moment. So yeah, and the other thing that I struggled with, I think, in this piece is just, I feel like it's really, really pessimistic. So, like it's kind of a depressing story. And I feel like there's a tension in it between, on the one hand, me wanting to not look away, to be unflinching in the assessment of like, a lot of the damage that has been done cannot be fixed. And even if a massive effort were to be made right now, today, to fix it, some stuff has just, it's too late. And for a lot of other things, you know, especially when it comes to judicial appointments, some of those are lifetime appointments, and we're going to be dealing with this for the rest of at least my life. I teach constitutional law at UMass, and I'm looking ahead like it's going to be a grim couple decades here, and I just don't know a way around that. So on the one hand, me sort of saying things are really bad, they've been bad, and they're unlikely to get better anytime soon. But then sort of at the very end, trying to say, but maybe from the ashes, something good can rise, and not really having a great answer. So I absolutely take your point, Nora, that part is not as well fleshed out as the rest of the paper, because
it's a difficult question. Really challenging.
But I do, I mean, there's been some really interesting developments just in the past 24 hours around TPS here in the Biden administration. And it seems like he is willing to use that tool pretty aggressively to bring some groups into at least some form of protected status that have been floundering for quite some time. And so I appreciate that you brought up TPS. I think it's a very appropriate thing to add to this story. And I didn't talk about it in this paper, but I very much see it as part of the larger RSD regime. It's one of the ways in which, you know, in my 2014 book, I talk about it as an example of complementary protection. It's absolutely not as robust a form of protection as actual real refugee status, but it's a way in which the US's net of protection has been stretched a little wider. And so I think adding that into this paper is a fantastic idea, especially since it seems like it is a tool that is being deployed by the Biden administration. And I think that's a fabulous suggestion. One of the things that I'm still really wrestling with, I just in January read the new Cox and Rodriguez book, which I found very relevant to this project. I recommend it to any of you who have not yet read it, but you know, they talk a lot about the power of an executive and how much of an influence an executive can have. And I completely agree on so many levels with their argument. But the thing that I'm struggling with and that I raised in the paper is whether presidents on two sides of this divide can have equal and opposite impacts. And I'm skeptical about that. So I'm much more easily convinced that an executive who's looking to shut the system down is able to flaunt executive authority to do so. And I'm a little bit less sure that a president who wants to find ways to be less totally inhumane can use a system that's sort of designed as a border control apparatus to do that. It's just less natural. And certainly when we're talking about being the top of a massive pyramid of a bureaucracy, many of the individual actors who go into this work are going to be more oriented towards the work of exclusion, and more willing and able to follow directions that sort of give them the authority to crack down and be harsh and say no. And so I agree with your suggestion, Nora, that one of the ways that this could be done is to drastically increase the number of asylum officers, so people at that level of the system. One of the ways in which I was very lucky in the past year to be supervisor on a dissertation where My graduate student actually worked as an asylum officer for a year, and that was her field work, but it was also her professional job. And so I cited in the paper Elizabeth Reedford, but it's a fantastic dissertation because she was able to really talk from the inside about how much time pressure they had on their work during the Trump administration, and how much they were basically told to, like, you know, work the system and get people through it as quickly as possible. And I personally don't believe that that lends itself to a thorough and fair assessment of a case. Oftentimes it is has the opposite effect, and that's what she found in her dissertation. And so investing more in allowing people to take the time that is needed to give the hearing the hearing that it is due, and giving immigration judges clerks, right? Just more of a investment in that system would be sort of one of the first suggestions that I would make. I'm curious to hear what other people have to say, because I must confess I'm really not feeling very optimistic in this moment, and I would love to. I had a mentor once that said, hope is totally irresponsible. But I also feel like it's irresponsible not to have hope in moments like this. And so I'm really trying. And the other thing I would love suggestions on is, I feel like I try to do this comparative thing, but I don't sustain it as fully throughout every part of the paper as I could. And so finding ways or seeing places where people would like to know more of the comparative story would be helpful for me. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you both very much indeed for this very rich exchange on a very rich paper. I realized that, thrown off by Beethoven, I never introduced myself. I am Yannis Kalpouzos, and I'm a visiting assistant professor here at BU School of Law. And on this note, I would like to invite all our guests, including and perhaps especially our student guests, to contribute with questions, thoughts. We have about 15 minutes, so I would like to ask both questions and responses to be relatively concise so that we can get as many in as possible. You can use your Zoom hands. We all have Zoom hands. And or I can use my moderator's privilege to begin by asking a question myself, if I may, because yeah, so I read that paper and I found it fascinating, and I also, like Professor Nora Lori, I was really struck by the idea of temporality and the idea of time, and the extent to which also the idea of lost time refers to and evokes, to some extent, a counterfactual, right? It evokes a alternative, right, evolution of things. And it strikes me that this, to some extent, mirrors a lot of our understanding of the Trump presidency and our grappling with, to what extent is it an exception to the rule, or to what extent is it a continuation or an accentuation or a deterioration of trajectories that already existed, and how should we approach and understand the evolution of the building of a fortress America and immigration law in this particular context. And in that context, I was also struck by, well, one, the reference to the chaos and the way that both movements in either direction, exploit or happen in the chaos of the different institutions and the different kinds of rules that exist in this particular context, and the position that there is nowhere near the same level of consensus about liberalizing asylum processes as there is about other aspects of immigration policy, right? And therefore, if there hadn't been the Trump presidency, would we perhaps have seen perhaps less vandalism, but also lost time in other ways? So that's my question.
Do you want me to answer, or do you want to take
I believe we also have a question by Professor Macklin. So maybe
I'd love to hear it.
I'll ask.
Hi, Audrey.
Hi, Rebecca. Hi, Noura. Hi, everyone. That was it's a wonderful paper and a presentation about it. My question is about the stickiness of power, and you talked about, and I find it persuasive, this concern about how moves to, in effect, dismantle asylum are easier to achieve through executive power than perhaps moves in the other direction. I also wonder if you have any thoughts about stripping away the politics of it, whether the executive or indeed legislatures also are reluctant to simply retract any power that has been expanded. So the reason I say this is because, you know, in other countries, and certainly in Canada, you see governments have done things that are terrible. The Trump government has done things that are terrible. And inevitably, you see some of it undone, but never all of it undone. And there are various factors that account for it. But sometimes, especially when you see them defending it in court, I wonder if it is simply about, now that we have an additional power, we don't want to give it up. We may not choose to exercise it in this particular way, but what we want to preserve is the power to do it. And so we will resist revising and reverting anything that seems to have expanded the power we have. And that operates at some level, not quite autonomously, but in some sense, independent of how that power is being exerted.
I
Yeah.
think
Oh,
we
go
can
ahead.
try to answer these two questions first, and then we'll ask for other questions.
Thank you for these questions. It's a big part of the Cox and Rodriguez book is this question about executive power. And my understanding of their argument is that people who think that presidents, whether we're talking about Obama or Trump, sort of usurped what was rightfully a legislative power and took the power into the executive branch and then used it. People who think that that was inappropriate or somehow against our constitutional order are misunderstanding our constitutional order. And what Cox and Rodriguez seem to be arguing is that, like, executive power is a huge part of immigration policy making and should be, I guess, like, and that it's okay. And I think I read them as basically saying, so hi, Biden, like, take the power and do the equal and opposite amount of exerting it that we saw over the past few years. And I guess my reaction that I'm still, thinking about with their book is, I don't think we can. I don't think that's possible. And so I think there is something a little bit dangerous about that idea of, like, well, now it's our turn to take it and do stuff with it, because I completely agree with you that I don't think even if they started today with every ounce of their energy to, like, undo each thing systematically, that's not an agenda. This is just like, so I think that there's some, I think there's a huge need for congressional action, and it's just about, I don't know, hopefully getting there. So I don't know if that really answers your question about the stickiness of power, but.
I think I'm reminded that there are differences in how it's understood, and I'm familiar a little bit with Cox and Rodriguez. I just meant that the reversal of bad policy, why aren't all bad policies reversed? And sometimes it's that the bad policy has appeared to expand a power that had not been exerted before, and they don't want to give up on that.
Yeah, that's very possible.
I'll just let it go.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess is the better answer. I'm still waiting to see what the commitment of this administration is when it comes to thinking about our borders. And I don't know if they know yet what their take on this is going to be. I get a little bit nervous anytime any policy is trying to rely really, really heavily on, don't worry, we'll be tough on the bad guys, but we'll be really soft on the good guys. Like, I think that was what Obama tried to do. And I don't think it, I think it's based on a totally false premise, and I don't know. I think this administration has to figure out how on earth they're going to thread that needle. I think I might have forgotten Jonas's question. It was something about the counterfactual.
Yes, it was about yes, it was about what was the alternative trajectory and whether the alternative trajectory would have been time gained or also
Right.
lost.
I love that
in a different
idea.
way.
Counterfactual. As soon as you said it, I realized I've been doing that for 4 years. Almost feeling like we're on a train track and there's like another train. And you're yearning to leap across the tracks to the other one because there's this assumption that everything over there would be very nice.
That sounds dangerous too.
Perhaps it wouldn't have been as magical as we imagine our alternative reality to be. But yeah, because I think I have no idea what a Clinton administration would have been like on asylum. Really, I mean, I'm pretty confident that it would have been less horrific than what we saw. But I think the Democratic Party has a really, really, really major dilemma on its hands. And I think that it needs to do a lot of thinking about how on earth to proceed here, because, I mean, this gets into the topic of my next book, which I didn't really talk much about in this paper, but it's been on my mind for a long time. But I don't think that trying to sort out the assumption that border crossers are either vulnerable and deserving victims of persecution or totally economically motivated and undeserving has served us in any way, shape, or form. And I think that, for me at least, that's the big sticking point, that until we figure out how to handle what's going on our southern border and to understand it differently than we've been understanding it, then I don't think it's not just a matter of like doing the work, it's a matter of having the imagination and vision to even know where to begin. And I think right now, it's almost like there's the low-hanging fruit. We're in the low-hanging fruit part of the projects. It's like there's a lot of stuff that should be undone. But beyond that, there needs to be something more, something actually proactively imaginative. Tali?
Yeah, Tali, and I understand that Professor Laurie also has a follow-up. Maybe Tali, you can ask the question and then we can try to address those. We have about 4 minutes left before our break.
Yeah, these are not exactly questions, or more comments and suggestions on how to undo the lost time, as you and Nora were discussing before. So maybe a few things I thought about as I was reading this. One thing that we need to acknowledge is that over the course of a lost time, people also lost access to a lot of evidence. And it actually gets back to something that we discussed yesterday when we were talking about Sabi's paper. The evidentiary requirements right now when you got this are just so ridiculously high. And with the fact that people were just exposed to a bunch of experiences that cost them so much time and so much access to evidence as a result, that's maybe one potential thing to reconsider and restructure. You guys talked about TPS, and I think that's really crucial, but then, figuring out how to do TPS properly so that people are not kept in this liminal situation is also crucial. And then also stopping this approach to TPS as if it's some kind of charity, right? It's a concrete response to concrete international legal obligations that countries have to protect people. So, I mean, it's not just a kind of generosity or kindness. And then the other thing that I thought about is to address the sort of implicit notion about the lost time and what it means for people's time, right? What it suggests about the lack of value that immigrants' time has, and maybe address it through better inclusion policies that give their time and, you know, agency and subjectivity as a whole, the kind of space that people are actually deserving of, and not treating them, you know, in that liminal approach that we have seen, including, you know, in the labor market and in other spheres. So just some thoughts.
Professor Laurie, if you can, in 2 minutes.
Yes, I mean, it's I think Audrey's point about once people have power, how do you take it away from them was really thought-provoking for me. And it made me really think about both what you were saying about your student and the work that she was doing as working in as border control, but Hernandez's book Migra, where she, I don't know if people have had a chance to look at it, but she basically shows how border control in the southern US border, that it shifted relationship between different white communities, and how poor or white communities were now able to become federal police officers and exert power on these landowners who are bringing in these Mexican migrants. And so it was an interesting way, I think, of showing how suddenly this gives you a direct power over people's lives. And for me, border control is dangerous because it's petty positions of power, and those are the most dangerous people. Having been in different interrogation rooms in different border zones, you realize that there's something like about the ability to exert that power that changes social class, and also it becomes difficult to undo. So it's not really a response other than to say, I think that's a really important dimension of thinking about lost time, or what happens is getting people to let go of a new form of power is very challenging.
Yes, certainly at the lowest levels of the system. Audrey's point is so well taken, because telling people, like, use your discretion to enforce the law, they like it. But then you say, oh, now use your discretion to not, to like judiciously hold back your power. I agree with you. I don't think that comes as naturally. I wasn't understanding your question to be more at the higher policy levels, but Nora brought in this really interesting example of it.
Thank you all. And I think, Professor Hamlin, your point about the stultifying effect of the categorization between deserving and undeserving, both in domestic political discourse, but also as is reflected in international law categories of the international refugee system, I think plays an important role in limiting, the power that we have to change things for the future, regain lost time, however we want to look at it. But it does feel a little bit like we're getting started. We're only getting started, which perhaps is appropriate. And now we have to take a break. It's 12:57. Maybe we'll reconvene 2 minutes past 1 to proceed with the next session. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate it.